Welcome to Her Discovered Power, the podcast where we try to provide every single good hearted woman tools and knowledge that can empower and free you from so many of the emotional aspects that impact you most from our earliest teachings and societal implications. I'm Dave Jones with Captive Coaching and Empowerment, and this is my mission and my passion because of what I've seen happen with the women in my life, including my own mother. We're here to help you be the she that you were meant to be. Hope you follow us, hope you share us, and hope you enjoy the episode.
Well, good morning, David, and welcome back, everyone, to Her Discovered Power. Today, we're talking about a topic that so many women quietly struggle with, often for years, but they don't have words for what it is. And it's why do good hearted women, emotionally intelligent women, silence themselves? Why do we shrink in rooms where we actually belong? And why do we betray our own truth just to keep the peace? And the bigger question, how do we start coming back to our voice without fear? This is a conversation that hits home for me, and I think it's going to for a lot of people listening. So, to help us unpack this, I'm joined by my co host, David Jones, resident expert and founder of Captive Coaching and Empowerment, and the creator of the Apache Emotional Development Framework. So, David, I'm really glad that we're talking about this today.
Sherry, I'm right there with you. I'm really glad we're talking about this today as well because this really is one of the most common and most misunderstood emotional struggles that women face.
Yeah. Yeah. Let's start with something that probably feels familiar to everybody. You know, when you're somewhere and you're in a group and everyone seems to agree on something, and you may see it differently, but you don't speak up or you laugh along, even though something inside you is whispering, this isn't what I think. Or you say it's fine when it's not, or even when we apologize for having a need. David, what's actually happening here when we do that?
Well, it's interesting. And I think you personally would be able to relate to that apologizing for having a need, don't you?
I do.
Yeah.
Did.
Did. It's crazy. So many times this occurs. And it happens because, Sherry, unfortunately, most women are not taught really to be authentic. They're taught to be acceptable. And those are two very different things. And as with so many things that you and I discuss on this show, Sherry, women aren't the only ones that today's topic affects. It's just that it affects women, I think, a lot more often and frequently than men. But it tends to affect women even more deeply, let alone more frequently. And Sherry, the silencing that we're talking about or that shrinking, it's not done because, the women that we're speaking about are weak. It's done because their silence is conditioned inside of them. They're conditioned emotionally, socially, and mostly unconsciously to realize that the emotional safety depends on being agreeable. Their emotional safety depends on them being pleasant, on them being non-disruptive. Does that make sense?
Mm. Something you said, they're taught to be acceptable. That just really gave me goosebumps because it's so sad. It's scary. And we're not acting in accordance with our true selves, but this set of conditioning that was learned a long time ago makes me sad.
Yeah. It is tragic because we lose so much within that child, and that child loses so much behind the eight ball, so to speak, as their growth and development occurs. And it's all done because it really comes down to emotional survival. And it starts long before, as we know, before adulthood.
Hmm. One of the things that you taught me that really shifted how I understand myself is the emotional system, because I think a lot of us assume I just need to be more confident or I should be able to speak up, but it's much deeper than that. So, can you walk us through that here?
Absolutely, and I love how you put that because it is so much more deep, and it's a lot deeper a lot of the time than we have the opportunity on our show to go into, but we're gonna dig into it here. And one of the ways that I teach this, as you know, Sherry, is that we have 3 emotional components effectively. The first is the unconscious emotional mind. In my coaching, I call it the UEM just because I have a hard time putting all that word together. In the UEM, the unconscious emotional mind, this is the oldest and fastest part of our emotional system. It is the first, obviously, that's developed because it's the oldest, and it forms very, very early in childhood. And it's where we store our belief system, our sense of worth, our emotional rules, our coping defense mechanisms, and the interpretations we shape from different trauma and drama. Then the second part is we have the conscious emotional mind. Now, the conscious emotional mind, this is the part of us where we feel emotions in real time, but it's only because we've received what our unconscious emotional mind has sent to us based on what it believes we can consciously handle. And we'll get into that correlation between the two of those, but the tie between those creates a bond that is different from the third element, and that is our intellectual brain. Now, for those of our listeners that have not heard me talk about this in the past, our intellectual brain is really in charge of only two things. Number one is our autonomic processes, where it controls our heart and our diaphragm, all the things, Sherry, that automatically go without us having to consciously think. And then the other part is it controls our logic, which includes mathematics. And one of the things where the intellectual brain and our conscious and unconscious emotional mind kind of tied together is when it comes to rationalizations, which we'll get back to. Okay. But here's the myth. And this is one of the things that you have mentioned on this show that you absolutely hate to acknowledge.
I'm thinking it as you're doing it.
The myth is that we're taught from childhood that our intellectual brain, as it develops, is the one in charge, but it's not. It is 100% our unconscious emotional mind that is the driver of our bus.
That was a really hard concept for me to accept, honestly. So, what you're saying is everything is kind of filtered through the unconscious emotional mind and doesn't get to the conscious emotional mind unless the unconscious emotional mind allows it to get through. The intellectual brain doesn't really have any part in that.
It really doesn't. Once we get that filtered information, like you so perfectly just said, goes into the conscious emotional mind, sent over to the intellectual brain to be able to speak about it, vocally, and utilize all of the other tools that the intellectual brain is in charge of as far as our physiology and all things relating to our body. But the reality is, it will only give the conscious emotional mind anything that unconscious emotional mind thinks it can handle. And this is the location and this is the process where we hear about, if we want to talk about an extreme example and a sad example, this is the part where we always hear about different traumas that occurred in childhood that people don't consciously remember until they go into a hypnosis or some event evokes this memory, right?
Mhm.
This is the reason because the unconscious emotional mind will actually block it from going to the conscious emotional mind until it thinks it's ready. And for a less extreme example, one of our episodes, I used the example you remember about me not being able to have my photograph taken for years.
Mhm.
That is because my unconscious emotional mind did not feel until my conscious emotional mind was ready for it that it could handle re experiencing the trauma of being attacked by that German Shepherd.
Hmm. So it's somewhat of a good thing too. But it also explains why intellectually we can know we're safe, but we still feel threatened by speaking up.
That's exactly right. And I'm glad you tied that back to that because that's where the essence really comes about, where we're getting into why we shrink or why we don't stand up or why we feel we have to silence ourselves. It is our unconscious emotional mind doesn't care about the logic. What it cares about is familiarity. If something is unfamiliar, like asserting ourselves, it feels dangerous to the unconscious emotional mind, and it's not going to allow us to do it because anything it doesn't understand or has experienced previously is considered a threat.
Mm. Yeah, that really stuck with me during our coaching. Anything unfamiliar to our emotional system can feel like a threat. Like, it's hard for me to understand that, even if it's good, even if it's something good.
Yes, because our unconscious emotional mind, first of all, doesn't care whether or not something is good or bad from what we perceive consciously in our reality. And it's not that anything that is considered unfamiliar can be seen as a threat, it is that all things unfamiliar will be seen as a threat. And it's fascinating as we dig into it because when we were a child, we learned emotional rules. And as you remember in my coaching, in my philosophy, I call these pool rules as the acronym for primary occurrence of learning. Well, we learn these rules to create a safe level and position within our environment. It's what we learned and created to allow ourselves to live within the constraints and the confines of the boundaries that were set for us. But it's also basically sharing all the things that we learned that our caretakers required and expected from us so that we would be, let's say, in good graces with them. We knew what we could do. Now, you know what I mean? We knew what
Mhm.
we couldn't do, but they're more so than the spoken rules. It was all the things where, if we saw this look on our mother's face, we knew not to press her, right?
Mhm.
And so those are the types of rules that also come along more so than you have to ask for an extra cookie. We're talking about the emotional rules. And that's what created this entire set of coping and defense mechanisms that make us survive. And so, for many women, those rules outside of those spoken rules, Sherry, so many of those unspoken rules sounded like this: don't make waves, don't challenge authority. That sound familiar?
Mhm.
Don't upset anyone. Don't express your needs. Don't be too much. And here's a big one: don't risk rejection because unconsciously, when we risk rejection, what do we do, Sherry? How does that feel to a child?
It's scary.
Terrifying,
It's
right?
scary. I mean, you need them for survival.
Exactly. Those rules were specifically built for our childhood survival, and that's why they were brilliant. These rules allow a child to know both consciously and unconsciously how to behave, to conform and fit within their environment, and that's what makes them feel safe, right?
Mhm.
And
Mhm.
right,
Yeah.
protected by and connected to their environment is the whole issue there. We want to feel that protection, but we also need that connection. And that is why it's usually our family that is the environment that we're talking about at that point. And at the same time, and conversely, Sherry, unconsciously, this allows us to know and kind of alerts our unconscious emotional mind to the fact that if we don't conform, the consequence is that we would be excluded or cast aside. And are we going to interpret that as safe?
Hmm. So what you're saying is these rules, they once helped keep her safe as a child, so they weren't bad then, but now as an adult, she'll stay quiet in meetings or avoid conflict in relationships. It's not that she's weak, she's just following these emotional rules that were never updated. She didn't even know she created them.
That's exactly right. And you know what I find very interesting from this prospect and from this aspect that I go over with my clients all the time is that the vast majority of good-hearted people always lived by a barometer of comparison to these rules to determine how they measured up. And it's almost a continual process within those early years. And it worked in such a way. And by the way, here I'm specifying the good-hearted people because for those who aren't, they didn't really care about conforming. They didn't necessarily feel that they had to feel safe. It was that they might even create their own levels of safety. But as we grow, the good hearted people always maintain a comparison of how do I measure up to that or how do I measure up to this one? Each of us created this set of coping defense mechanisms that formed a set of perfect emotional patterns that allowed us to stay within the pool rules for the safety of childhood so that they survived and persevered as best as possible during those years. But like you said, those rules were needed then. Now in adulthood, they can become suffocating, which is why you're so exactly right. And in the example that you use, that woman is not reacting to the room she's in. She's reacting to the emotional rules she learned when she was 2, 3, 4, or maybe 8 years old.
Hmm. Crazy. So
It is, right?
it really is. So this brings me to one of my favorite concepts that you've taught me is the adapted self versus the authentic self because I think so many women feel this internal pull but don't understand what it is. Can you break that down?
Sure. And, in my coaching, depending upon how somebody considers different aspects, I might utilize different terminology with each different client so that it can relate a little differently. But the collective term here is that adaptive self. And it is the version of us that formed in childhood to survive, like we were just talking about. But with the good-hearted woman that we're talking about today and why this affects women so much more frequently, well, during this time, she learned to please. She learned to appease, maybe stay quiet, avoid conflict. She learned to anticipate others' needs and really while minimizing her own. So it required her to stay emotionally small. And this was not out of that weakness. It was because her system she created was brilliant. It kept her safe. And then the authentic self, well, the authentic self is who she was before the world taught her to shrink, before the world taught her to conform so that she didn't get cast aside. That makes sense?
Mhm.
That's where she is grounded. She's self led, she's emotionally honest, she's aligned with her values, capable of healthy conflict, and willing to be seen and known. That's her authenticity. And the misalignment happens when the adaptive self overrides the authentic self. And that's really where the difficulty comes in adulthood.
So that's the tension we feel, like the feeling of shrinking. It's the part of you that knows the truth, but the other part is trying to keep you safe.
Exactly. Authentic self wants truth. Her adaptive self wants safety. Yourself, well, that wants authenticity and integrity, but her unconscious emotional mind most wants familiarity. And that's the emotional gridlock and conflict that is created.
Hmm. As we're discussing this, I'm wondering what toll this is taking on us because I think a lot of women feel the exhaustion, the resentment, or even that disconnection, but don't always connect it back. Is there emotional cost for not speaking up? I'm assuming that we feel this pretty deeply.
Oh, hell yes. And this is one of the reasons that this affects women more deeply, even though impacts them more frequently, if that makes sense. Because you're 100% right, they do. The cost is absolutely there. And every time she silences herself, she feels it. Every time she shrinks, she feels it. Every time she betrays her truth, she feels it. And like I mentioned, men will feel the same thing, good-hearted men who are in that circumstance, but they don't feel it as deeply, and it's not confirmed and echoed socially and throughout her entire existence. And yes, she does lose a piece of herself each and every time it happens because self-silencing leads to that emotional exhaustion that you referenced, anxiety, self-doubt, all of the things. It's basically the grief of what she has already realized unconsciously that she has lost. It leads to identity confusion and disconnection from whatever she may feel in her future self. Starts to doubt to trust herself. And self trust is a foundation of the proper alignment, Sherry, because when she repeatedly acts against her truth, her emotional system reinforces old childhood beliefs that says, my truth is unsafe, my needs don't matter, and my voice creates danger. So let me remain silent.
Hmm. And that's why I guess it can feel like self abandonment because, in a way, it is.
Absolutely, it is.
Mm. Hmm. Well, let's shift into something more hopeful, how women can reclaim their voice. We like to call it empowerment, but where does a woman begin reclaiming her voice?
I love the way that you ask that because you make a distinction between the process and the result. Because the process is the reclaiming, the result is the empowerment. And I really break that down into 6 steps, Sherry. The first part, and these are the pillars of my Apache framework, but effectively it comes down to 6 steps. Number one, we've got to understand our emotional system because we can never change what we don't understand. And therefore, we can never grow out of it until we know what grew into it, if that makes sense.
It does.
And our unconscious emotional mind, right, it's really not our enemy, it's our oldest protector. And this is the part where it creates the awareness because understanding how and why our original pool rules were necessary then, and that those rules remain in force and throughout our adult life until we take responsibility for creating new pool rules. So that's why the first step is to understand, basically become aware of how our emotional system works, because then we can go to step two. And step two is where we start to reconnect with our authentic identity. And that reconnection is really the heart of the Apache model, here. It's where our authentic self, we realize, isn't fragile, it's just unfamiliar. So, this point, we have two big pillars of the Apache framework. Number one, this is where we realize we no longer need permission from anybody else. We
Amen.
don't need permission, right? We no longer need permission of how to be, how to speak, how to be seen. This is the point where we start to realize and acknowledge to ourselves that we now grant ourselves permission and seek permission from no one ever again. And that brings us into the pillar of acceptance and the acceptance of the limitation of our caretakers. That's the first step of acceptance. We have to understand that the difficulties that we had that are causing us now problems and pain in our adult life that were created from the perfect coping and defense mechanisms in our childhood, those were created so that we could deal with having to find ourselves acceptable within those early years because of the limitations our caretakers had at the time. Well, we could sit there and we could blame our caretakers that this is what they caused, but the reality is they didn't have a manual either. So when I'm working with a client, I'm pointing out a very, very important and distinct difference between cause and blame. Our caretakers were the cause of all of these things that each individual child develops and perhaps causes them pain in adulthood, but they aren't to blame because they had no idea what they were doing any more than we do. So it's just that we would seek our children to accept we did our best, just like we want them to know our best was out of our love for them. We have to accept that our caretakers did the best with what they had as well.
I think that's an important point because you don't want to be angry at your caretakers, and that's just a way to kind of smooth it over for yourself, is understanding the cause versus blame.
The way you put that is 100% correct. And it eliminates the ability or the need to be angry. But you know what? It also does, even in addition to that, is that Sherry, we've talked about this before on the show, that without providing our unconscious mind the reason for why our caretakers were, whether or not it was helpful, whether or not it was healthy, whether or not it was hurtful or unhealthy, unless we give our unconscious emotional mind and our conscious emotional mind a reason for why they cannot be held accountable and for blame, we will create a system inside of us that will defend them,
I remember that.
right?
Hmm.
And when we have to defend them, there's only one other person that has to take the blame, and that's us.
Yeah.
So it really is a two-pronged effort, like you mentioned. It eliminates the anger toward them, but it also allows us to be free from having to blame ourselves like we did when we were children, where we took on the responsibility that our parents or our mother or our father was in a bad mood. I must have done something wrong, kind of thing. Make sense?
Hmm.
So then we get to the next step, and that is start to build our alignment between our adapted and our authentic self and eliminate the differences. And that's where we start to begin to be able to say authenticity is safe now, whereas it wasn't previously. This is where choice comes into play, Sherry. It's where we choose to create our new pool rules and we choose to forgive those that we could not previously accept, even if they're no longer allowed within our pool. And this is where we are now building tolerance for emotional exposure, where we begin to, in small ways and examples of exposure, say, we commit to saying one honest sentence or commit to expressing one preference each day. It's where we dipping our foot into our pool. Don't you love this metaphor of pool? But it really is. It's where we get to gently disagree and we can realize that the sky doesn't fall. And when we're able to show ourselves this, we're now choosing how we are going to be instead of having been forced for the sake of safety to be that previous way.
It's empowerment.
It's huge, isn't it?
Hmm.
I know you know specifically, and you share so often within our episodes of that power of the freedom that you started to feel at that point. And then we get to that point where it almost becomes that second nature. And by the way, that's the point where we start to realize we can feel and acknowledge the discomfort instead of you know and we wouldn't even necessarily call it fear. We call it that discomfort, that desire to shrink. If the spotlight was on us, we started to feel uncomfortable, right?
Hmm.
This is the point where we no longer run from it because we're now acknowledging that it's there. We're acknowledging it's not out of weakness, it's out of having to abide by those earlier rules. And now we start to ask ourselves when we feel that sense of discomfort, what fear am I trying to avoid? And when we realize that we have the strength and it's not weakness, we no longer have to hide from those fears. And boy, I know you can remember that. And my clients, when are able to then sit there and say, I have these fears, and it's weird because I have this internal sense of power then I'm acknowledging I have fear. And doesn't that seem like a paradox
Mm.
compared to what we learned as a child?
It does, but it's just authentic. That's why you can stay in it.
Exactly. And that's why fear really, when we understand our emotional system, fear does no longer have to be considered an enemy and something that we hide from. And by the way, hide from others. It now becomes the ally because it becomes almost like a helper of the symptom that'll dictate and help us diagnose what issue we are now able and ready to address next. And then we get to the point of healing. In healing is where we update those emotional rules that you were talking about that needed to be updated. It's where our childhood rules are acknowledged and then rejected. We now are saying, nope, we got the new ones that we've written. Us now, they were perfect for us then, but now we've rewritten new rules, and the healing now begins as a consequence of those previous steps towards growth. And now we acknowledge that those new pool rules are for our protection now and for the rest of our lives. And to complete the healing, we've got to follow them. And that's when we reconnect with our authentic self completely. And that develops that emotional internal safety. And when you talking about empowerment or embodiment, which is the next stage, that's where we now act as the version of who we really were prior to any of that toxicity that changed us and required us to abide by those previous sets of rules. And this is where our new existence, our new being, and our new revealing, how about that?
Mm.
And is able to release that authentic self to the world and is embraced as someone we are now. And that's where we learn to anchor ourselves instead of relying on an external approval. Our new value, our new validation now comes from within rather than from without.
Hmm. I mean, I feel that even as you're saying it. I'm wondering though, do you go back and forth through these steps, depending on the situation or topic that you're dealing with?
Yeah, you always ask fantastic questions. So, if we're staying within the same topic, 100% we always will end up then going back and forth, but we'll only in that process only go back one step, because then if we've done it properly and completely, when we feel that trigger that makes us revert that one step, for instance, from embodiment, we'll step back into the having to go over the healing process again. And that'll bring us back to that embodiment. But here's the interesting thing, we could be dealing with how to keep ourselves from silencing ourselves at the same time as maybe we have the desire to be growing with a sense of how do we show our authenticity in love or in a relationship, an entirely different element, right? Then we could be on a different step. But it's fascinating as we go through this process how much it advances all aspects of our existence.
Hmm.
So yes, you'll go back and forth.
Okay. That makes sense. I mean, but I do think you'll get through it faster, maybe as you go back and forth, once you get through it and know what it feels like at the end.
Absolutely, and it's one of the reasons that I created Apache in the first place, Sherry. You probably remember this. I don't know if I've ever shared this really on the show, but the reason I came up with the Apache framework was so that therapists and counselors had this formula that they would be able to go over with their clients so that they would make progress so quickly to get to the heart of the matter of whatever individually that they were trying to deal with, because typically therapy and counseling, it takes several sessions just to create that bond and that level of trust between client and therapist, right?
Hmm.
And so I wanted to create the steps that help them as a team so that trust is automatically created at the end. Because at the end, as you just mentioned, ladies, this is the point that you have heard Sherry talk about many times. This is the point of absolute freedom. Our new knowledge and our new perspective of self is now just absolutely inherent to our being. It is our self is now second nature. Our new self is existing without thought or consideration, only realized and appreciated as the compliments, for instance, that are placed upon us that are for being the model of the empowered woman. We will get those, but we don't understand necessarily why, because it's just simply the new us. And for women, this work is not just healing, it's liberation.
Mm. As you were saying that, I was thinking, yes, I mean, it feels amazing, but it also feels natural.
Yeah.
Like I'm not fighting against myself anymore.
Yes. Yes. I love how you put that, because you're not only are we not fighting against ourselves when we get to that point, it's like we are lifting a pall off of us, isn't it?
Hmm.
It's like we have had this wound and we now know that it's healed, so we can take off the suffocating bandage and the suffocating band-aid where we have had on for our entire existence. It's almost like feeling like our skin can breathe. Does that make sense?
Hmm. Yeah.
It's powerful.
It is. It really is. This has been such a meaningful conversation. I think my takeaway from it is a lot of this was learned, which to me, it means it can be unlearned. So, David, before we close, what do you want everyone listening to know?
You often ask me that, and so often I'm not prepared
Ah!
with that answer. But here's what I would love everybody to know, every listener to take from today. Uh, and it's similar to what I will often say, but I want to say it specifically like this. You're not acting out of alignment because you're weak. You're not getting that sensation that you're betraying yourself because you don't have the strength. It's because you're listening to the emotional system that you perfectly created all those years ago to conform and fit within the environment in which you grew. The reason that you might feel weak, the reason that you might feel that you're acting out of fear is because we are still using the outdated rules at that time. But the moment, ladies, that you become aware of that misalignment, you've already begun the process of returning to yourself, the self you were supposed to be. Your authentic self is not lost. It's that she's just waiting there under that bandage that needs to be pulled off. And you deserve to become the version of you that your little girl never got to be.
Mm, you said that so beautifully. She's not lost, she's waiting. Thank you, David. That was really nice. And thank you everyone for listening. I mean, your voice matters, your truth matters, your power is not gone. And as David said, it's simply waiting to be reclaimed.
Love it.
Hmm.
Love it, Sherry. Thank you so much for always doing this with me, Sherry. I've said it before. There's nobody else I'd rather do it with. So, ladies, for all of us here at Her Discovered Power, we will see you on the next episode. And Sherry, thank you so much. You have anything else?
Nope. Thank you.
We'll see you all next time. And remember, we're here so that you can be the she that you were meant to be.